Today is the last class. Next week is the final exam meeting period. So the final exam has been posted online. It's the exact same format as the midterm, 4 short essay questions, open book, etc. Are there any questions on the final? No? Everyone's okay? All right. So next week when we'll meet, what we'll do is we'll just watch a documentary and have a little discussion for our final meeting period. So we're going to finish chapter 18 today. We talked on Tuesday about some of the different types of foreign policy. Today we're going to break down how these types of diplomacy are used and have a discussion about U.S. intervention abroad. Okay. So diplomacy is part of foreign policy. It's basically the representation of a government to other governments. So it's an ambassador to the UK representing the American government. So our diplomats are the voice of the American government abroad. They are authorized to speak on behalf of the US government. So of course, we don't want people running around being stupid, getting drunk, causing all sorts of trouble. So in 1946, the Foreign Service Act established a professional, formal diplomatic corps. You have to pass the Foreign Service exam, and it is not an easy exam. Plenty of people fail the first time around. It's difficult because they want to make sure people are qualified to serve as ambassadors. It also helps if you can speak a common foreign language like Spanish, French, Arabic, and so on. So you want people who can speak the language, understand the culture, and won't make any mistakes that can come back to haunt us. But diplomacy takes time. Diplomacy is slow, especially when you're dealing with cultural differences. In countries like China and Japan, you don't just get down to negotiating. Sometimes you have to have a cup of tea. You have to have a conversation. You have to be careful how you talk. So presidents don't necessarily like diplomacy. They see it as too time-consuming. It takes too long. It's too tricky. Why can't we just get what we want? And they're also reluctant to give a lot of responsibility to foreign policy diplomats, right? You're trusting people to make the right decision. That's not easy for a president to do. And President George W. Bush was criticized for not using diplomacy to get our allies on board with the war in Iraq. His attitude was essentially, you're with us or you're against us, and if you're against us, get the hell out of the way. So obviously he wasn't able to get a lot of countries on board with us. France didn't get on board. Most of Europe didn't get on board. I'm not saying he would have been successful using diplomacy, but it might have been worth it to at least try to use diplomacy. And one of our major diplomatic tools is the United Nations. The UN was created at the end of World War II. The UN Charter was signed in San Francisco. And the idea behind the UN is to try to prevent another world war. The 20th century was extremely bloody in terms of massive world wars. Millions of people killed in World War I, millions more in World War II. Nobody wanted to see that happening again. So the UN works to try and promote peace, try to avoid global wars, or even wars between two countries as much as they can. But there's no standing army, and they don't have a lot of power to enforce their own rulings. So sometimes the UN just isn't able to do what it wants to do. And there are two main bodies in the UN. There's the General Assembly, which is made up of 192 member states. These include places like the Vatican and the Palestinian territories, as well as formal countries. The General Assembly meets from September to December of every year at the UN headquarters in New York City. This year, of course, it's largely been a virtual meeting. You can't have that many people at the UN. But usually, they meet at the UN headquarters. You need a 2/3 majority vote to pass a resolution, and each member only gets one vote. So this is where we sometimes see things like criticism of US policy abroad, or criticism of Russian interference into Ukraine, things like that. There's also the Security Council. There are 15 members, 10 who rotate, so they're elected every couple of years, and 5 permanent. The 5 permanent members are the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China. So basically the victors of World War II. Permanent members have the ability to veto a UN Security Council resolution. They can also be called into session at any time. So when there's a crisis, they will ask for the members to come to the Security Council. So right after 9/11, there was an emergency meeting of the Security Council. You only need 1 out of 5 votes to veto or kill a resolution. And it is used for political purposes. China will veto any resolution on North Korea. Russia vetoes any measure on Syria, and the United States routinely vetoes resolutions on Israel, for example, condemning their illegal building of settlements in Palestine. So if one of the permanent members vetoes, the resolution is dead, and there's nothing they can do about that. It has been criticized as unfair. Why should one permanent member be able to kill something critical? So you need 9 out of 15 to pass a resolution, but only 1 permanent member is needed to kill a resolution. There's also a lot of valid criticism of the fact that the 5 permanent members basically represent the US and Europe. Really not much representation for China, no permanent representation of Latin America, Africa, and so on. So there is some criticism of the UN for not being more globally significant, for being too Euro and American centric. All right, so in terms of our economic foreign policy, we are a member of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF as it's also known. The World Bank and the IMF were formed at the end of World War II to help countries rebuild during a crisis or after a war. So they provide short-term loans to countries. And post-World War II, the currency standard was moved from gold to US dollars. So the loans are given out in dollars and then converted into the local currency. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, the IMF provided around $10.5 billion in loans to help with currency stability. You have a whole bunch of countries that now need to form governments, rejoin the global economy, and create their own currency. So rather than leaving them to completely collapse, the IMF gave them enough money to be able to at least stabilize a bit economically so they wouldn't fall apart completely. So they do help when a country needs to rebuild after a war, like in Sierra Leone or Liberia, and they can help during an economic crisis. So for example, 2 weeks after 9/11, the IMF gave Pakistan a $135 million loan to help in the fight against the Taliban, right? Because you need Pakistan on board to try and help keep the Taliban from fleeing Afghanistan to Pakistan. So that's an example of a crisis where you're going to want to go in and provide the money to help them stabilize. They can help with things like famine, rebuilding countries after massive wars, clearing of landmines, and so on. And we also provide weapons and military aid to our allies. Anyone want to guess which two countries get the most military aid from the United States? Israel and Egypt are the two biggest recipients of military aid. Israel because they're our main ally in the Middle East, and Egypt because Egypt is kind of the border between the Middle East and Africa, because it's located in North Africa, so it's both Africa, Middle East kind of thing. So they get the most money and military aid. And we usually spend about $30 billion every year in terms of military and weapons aid. And we can choose to impose economic sanctions on a country or a leader who has violated international law. So we can place a trade embargo, freeze a foreign bank account, place a travel ban on someone. So up until recently, there were huge sanctions on the country of Sudan because the former leader, Omar al-Bashir, was committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide throughout most of the country. So we froze his foreign bank accounts. He wasn't supposed to travel outside of Sudan, and we put economic sanctions on the country. About 2 years ago, Omar al-Bashir was finally overthrown in a coup. So now they're moving towards democracy, and we've removed some of the sanctions to help the new government. We'll freeze the foreign bank accounts of leaders like Maduro in Venezuela, and we've put economic sanctions on Iranian oil because of the development of nuclear energy within Iran. So we can use economic sanctions to punish countries. We had severe sanctions on Iraq during the Saddam Hussein dictatorship period. So sometimes we can use economic policy to try and force a country to stop behaving so badly. We also engage in what's known as collective security. We are a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as it's more commonly known. And NATO was created in the late 1940s in response to the threat of the Soviet Union. So NATO used to be made up of mostly Western European countries. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, some Eastern European countries have joined NATO. And NATO provides military security to its members. Generally speaking, for a NATO mission, the United States will fund most of the cost. So with the Persian Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and we had to kick him out of Kuwait, it was a NATO mission. Members provided troops, we provided the weaponry. So we did cover most of the cost, but they provided most of the personnel. So usually with the NATO mission, we provide most of the weapons, they provide most of the people. And Article 50 can be invoked as necessary. Article 50 says an attack on one member is an attack on all members. So 9/11, they invoked the NATO Charter. They said the attack on the United States was an attack on democracy, was an attack on peace, and so they very quickly condemned the attack, and over 170 countries joined the coalition in the war on terror. The United Nations very quickly condemned the attack and basically said the United States can do whatever it needs to do to go after those responsible. So when we decided to invade Afghanistan, we had high levels of global support for this conflict. Huge numbers of countries volunteering supplies, intelligence, and so on. So it really was a global response to 9/11. And we've also seen NATO taking collective action against ISIS, because ISIS is a global threat. It's not like they're sitting in Iraq just doing nothing, right? They've carried out attacks throughout most of Europe. So because they are a global threat, NATO has taken collective action to try and push them out of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and so on. Okay, we are responsible for about a third of the military expenditures globally. And again, we do spend more on our military than the next 15 countries combined. Part of that is because, of course, when something happens, people look to the United States to try and solve the problem. And we have used military force to help out with humanitarian crises. It's necessary to use military force against ISIS to protect the Yazidi. The Yazidi are a religious minority, and their religion is a mixture of Christianity, Islam, and paganism. You have to be born into the religion. You cannot convert. They are a largely peaceful religious minority, but they have been persecuted throughout history in the Middle East. And ISIS has committed genocide against the Yazidi, murdering the men and forcing the women and girls into sexual slavery. So military force has been necessary to protect the Yazidi, to rescue victims of slavery, and to save the lives of this religious minority, because they are unfortunately being targeted by ISIS. So it's necessary to help provide humanitarian aid, but also to keep them from being completely massacred. The problem with military force is that it is risky. It's never going to be, we go in, we knock someone off, we leave again, right? It's dependent on a lot of external factors. How people are feeling, what opposition we face, and internal strife. So for example, people thought the war in Iraq was going to be short, and that we would defeat the Iraqi army pretty quickly. We did. We overthrew Saddam Hussein pretty quickly. That wasn't the hard part. The hard part is what comes next. We were not prepared for the massive infighting between groups that had been suppressed by Saddam Hussein. We were not prepared for the insurgent groups, the infighting, the this group versus this group struggle that happened. And of course, we weren't expecting ISIS to pop up into the fray. Democracy building is time consuming. If you want to go into a country that hasn't had democracy for 40, 50 years, you're going to be there for the better part of at least 2 decades. You can't just walk in, say, we got rid of the dictator, build a democracy, and walk back out. You gotta be there for a while. And the problem, of course, with that is we don't want to spend 20 years in Iraq, right? We don't still want to be there in 2030. And the more the war drags on, the less support there is from the American people. The public starts to lose patience. Opposition politicians say, well, you lied to us about the cost of the war. You were incompetent. Why is it taking so long? Why can't we just leave Iraq? What's the holdup? So the longer the war drags on, the less support there is. But wars are never really that short. A military intervention can be short. An actual war, not going to be short. Okay, any questions, comments? No? Everyone's good? Okay. Okay. So there are some legal tools that can be used to deal with conflicts with other countries. Arbitration is a common type of conflict resolution tool. And basically, when there's a disagreement between 2 countries or 2 groups, they are then referred to a neutral third party for resolution. So arbitration and mediation are common in international disputes. An example of this was in 1981, an international tribunal was set up to settle the issue of Iran's illegal seizure of the U.S. Embassy in 1979. When the rebels took over control of the embassy, they held people hostage for over a year, trashed the embassy, caused millions of dollars in economic damages. So this tribunal was set up so Iran could pay the United States for the damages done to the embassy. So they did. They reached an agreement, and the government of Iran gave the United States compensation for the damage done to the embassy. So arbitration can also be used to resolve an international economic or trade dispute. So if we put steel tariffs in place, we're likely going to be taken to court because countries aren't going to like that we've put tariffs on their steel. If we get into a trade dispute with China, it's likely going to be put into arbitration. So most international contracts contain an arbitration provision, as do domestic ones. If you ever actually read the terms of agreement for your credit card, cell phone, and so on, in all that legal jargon, there is a section that says, if there is a dispute between you and the company, you agree to enter into arbitration. Arbitration is binding. You may not win. In fact, arbitration largely exists to protect the company, not you. So if you get into a dispute with your cell phone carrier, legally you're obligated to enter into arbitration, and you may or may not win that dispute. So I know there's a lot to go through when you're looking at your contracts and stuff, but take another look at it. You'll see the provision about arbitration in there. Okay. There's also the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. The ICJ was created in 1946 to handle international legal disputes, mostly between countries. And they are based in The Hague in Netherlands. And they'll look at cases that involve trade, mining, etc. So one case that they've looked at is the Democratic Republic of the Congo versus Uganda. In 1998, Rwanda and Uganda invaded the country of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The idea behind it was to overthrow a dictatorship. But as the war dragged on, Rwandan and Ugandan soldiers were involved in illegal mining of Congolese minerals. If you look at your cell phone or your laptop, there is a mineral that is found in both of those that comes from countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So Ugandan soldiers have been accused of illegally mining the minerals and selling them on the global market. So Congo sued the country and said, "You've been stealing our resources." And Uganda was eventually forced to pay some settlement money and agree to stop doing this. Palestine has also sued the United States of America. We have, unfortunately, sometimes been supporting the building of illegal settlements in Palestine. Various Israeli governments have been trying to claim Palestinian territory as Israeli territory and violating international law by setting up homes and settlements. And we sometimes have been supporting the Israeli government on that. So we've been sued by Palestine because what happens is they go into a Palestinian village, tear down the existing houses, and build illegal settlements. So we've been sued by the Palestinians for supporting the building of illegal settlements. So the ICJ does not try war crimes or crimes against humanity. They're mostly looking at economic disputes, trade disputes. So the decisions that they make are final and they are binding. We have to abide by them. As a member of the court, if we are told you cannot build a settlement here, we cannot do so. So the decisions are binding. We do have to abide by them. The other body that's involved in legal disputes is the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. The ICC began working in 2002, and it is also based in The Hague. The ICC handles cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Genocide is essentially the attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So, like the Holocaust, Rwanda, and so on. Now, we are not a member of the ICC. We have refused to sign on because of fears that U.S. soldiers could be prosecuted for violations abroad. Sometimes soldiers don't behave the way we hope they would. So we aren't a member of the court, but we do work with the ICC. We will send them evidence, people, and so on. So currently they're looking at cases like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there have been human rights abuses, massacring of civilians, mass rape, and so on. Darfur, Sudan. Darfur is the western region of Sudan. It's about the size of Texas. And since 2004, there has been an ongoing genocide. The now former Sudanese government armed militia groups to go in, and the government would bomb the village. The ground troops would go in and slaughter civilians. About 500,000 people have been killed so far. There's also been the mass rape of women and girls as young as 6 years old in Darfur. So there are a couple of Sudanese leaders who have indictments against them for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Darfur. They are also looking into the government of Myanmar for their illegal killings of the Rohingya. The Rohingya are a minority Muslim group in a majority Buddhist country. The Myanmar military has been responsible for slaughtering the Rohingya, destroying their villages, and driving them to the border where they are left to starve. So some of the Myanmar leaders are under investigation for crimes against humanity and possible genocide. And the ICC is responsible for a couple of important decisions. In 1998, they released the first conviction for rape as an act of genocide in Rwanda. And then at the end of 2018, they found a Congolese leader, Bosco Ntaganda, also known as the Terminator, guilty of war crimes, including the mass enslavement of women for sexual slavery. So they recently convicted someone for sexual slavery as a war crime. At one point, the Democratic Republic of the Congo was labeled the worst country in the world to be a woman. So the fact that they are taking the crimes of rape and sexual slavery seriously is a positive step forward. So they have finally convicted someone for sex slavery as a war crime. So, progress. Foreign policy today is tricky. There's this clash between the idealism and the reality. We want our ideas of democracy and peace to be the governing foreign policy. And we like the idea that we would only use force as an absolute last resort. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And we've seen a contradiction with how we've been treating the enemy combatants in the war on terror. Torture is illegal under international law, but there is the practice of waterboarding, which is essentially simulated drowning. We were also engaging in a practice called extraordinary rendition, where U.S. forces would kidnap a suspected enemy combatant and take them to a country like Egypt or Syria where they're not so squeamish about torture. Here's the thing with torture. It doesn't work. If someone comes up to you, and I'm going to be graphic, I apologize, but basically says, I'm going to cut off your balls unless you tell me where the bomb is, you're going to make something up, right? You're not going to want to be tortured. So torture doesn't work, because all it does is get people to lie to stop the pain. So torture isn't actually a good way to get information from people. But it is still, unfortunately, sometimes used. But it's not going to work. Now, more often than not, it's more psychological torture. Leaving the lights on all day, blaring music so people can't sleep, things like that. But again, it doesn't actually tend to work. Because if you're being tortured, you're just going to say whatever they want you to hear, so they'll stop hurting you. On the plus side, actually on the downside, globalization has made it easier for non-state actors to attack and threaten us. All 19 of the 9/11 hijackers entered the United States legally. They came in on tourist visas. work visas. They took flying lessons. None of them were here illegally. So we gotta remember that. We gotta remember that it's not that hard for a terrorist to get a passport and fly to England, carry out an attack, and leave again. It's not that hard for someone to enter the United States, especially from countries like Saudi Arabia. So it's a lot easier for terrorists to set off a bomb in England or hijack a truck and run it through a crowd in Germany. On the other hand, increased trade and global economic interdependence have decreased the use of war. You're not going to go to war with your trading partner. We're not going after Saudi Arabia. We're not going to war with Canada. So what we're seeing in the 21st century is less traditional warfare. There are still civil wars that are a problem. But for the most part, the biggest threat in the 21st century is terrorism and non-state actors. Global warfare is unlikely. It's not impossible, it's just not very likely. So we have to be more concerned about terrorism, especially things like bioterrorism, hacking, and so on. So the 21st century is more going to be focused on non-state actors and less traditional warfare. So we have to be prepared to deal with the challenges of a changing world and changing foreign policy. Any questions on that? No? Okay. So now I want to talk about U.S. intervention abroad. A lot of the time, there's a lot of pressure for us to be the go-to country when something happens abroad, to be the first country in. And we can't always do that, right? We can't always be the one to intervene. Well, what happens if we choose not to? So I'm going to show you a clip from a documentary that shows an extreme example of what happens if we choose not to intervene. In 1994, in the country of Rwanda, there was a genocide. Rwanda is a country the size of Vermont that's located in East Africa. And from April to July of 1994, about 1 million people were killed in a very, very quick genocide. The United States did next to nothing to intervene in the conflict. We basically decided to sit on the sidelines because we did not want to get involved in another conflict. So I'm going to show you what happens when we chose not to intervene. So this is from a documentary called Ghosts of Rwanda that was released 10 years after the genocide to talk about what had happened in the country.
As the UN debated whether to keep a peacekeeping force in Kigali, the extremist Hutu leadership implemented the next phase of its plan: to spread killing across the nation by exploiting Rwanda's culture of obedience. They told Hutus the Tutsi rebels were foreign invaders and thought of turning them into slaves. Their propaganda reminded Hutus that the Tutsis had ruled them for centuries, often treating them with disdain.
Tutsis used to abuse Hutus. For example, if a Tutsi chief wished to stand up from his chair, he would call up a Hutu, who would allow his foot to be pierced by the Tutsi's spear as he stood up. My understanding is that Tutsis are not originally from Rwanda. They might have come from Egypt or somewhere else.
an extremist hate radio station told Hutus to eliminate their Tutsi neighbors.
When the war began, people changed. One day across the valley, we saw houses burning. Some people fleeing from their homes.
A 12-year-old girl named Valentina followed her parents into the Catholic Church in Nyirabuye, where along with more than 5,000 other Tutsis, they waited. It was April the 15th.
I was a young girl. My parents thought the church was safe because no one would be killed in the church. When we arrived, I could see the older people were very sad and upset. Everybody was scared, but nobody knew what was going to happen. The leader of the local police told us that Tutsis had fled to Nyirabuye and that we had to go there and kill them. On the morning of April 15th, we woke up and started walking towards the church. It was like going to the marketplace. I saw the soldiers coming in and they started shooting and shooting. All we had to defend ourselves were rocks. And our local governor, Trinity, came in and stood in front of us. Trinity said that everyone should know what they were there for. He said that all those who were there should be killed, but no one should survive. Then they started killing, hacking the machetes. They kept doing it, and I was hiding among dead people. They didn't kill me because of the blood covering me. They thought they had killed me. It was as if we were taken over by Satan. When Satan is using you, you lose your mind. We're not ourselves. You couldn't be no one and you started butchering people for no reason. We've been attacked by the devil. It was very late, around 2 a.m. when we returned home and came back. One of them stepped to my head. He was shaking me and he looked to see if I was alive. He said, "This thing is dead." And so they left. I lived among the dead for a long time. At night, the dogs would come to eat the bodies. Once a dog was eating something next to me. I threw something at the dog and it ran. I hid in a small room. That's where I stayed and slept for 43 days.
As the Tutsi rebel army pushed south towards the capital, they found evidence of massacres in village after village. levels approaching, extremist Hutus unleashed more terror convoy militias to accelerate the killing. The murdered prime minister had been replaced by a Jean Kambanda, who incited followers to repulse the Tutsi rebels and their sympathizers, known as Inkutani.
They continued in order to conquer power. Thereafter, they want to kill you. Guns are not only for soldiers. Every person can own a gun. If they shoot, you shoot back. I do carry one all the time. Here it is.
Okay. So again, like I said, we can't always intervene, right? We can't always step in and solve the problems. But this is a pretty extreme example of what happens if we choose not to, right? We chose not to intervene, and 1 million people were killed in 3 months. For context, we're talking 8,000 to 10,000 people killed every single day, and around 2,500 to 5,000 women raped every single day for 3 months. And the majority of the people were killed with machetes. If someone had enough money, they could bribe someone to shoot them, otherwise they were largely hacked to death. So keeping that in mind, is it the responsibility of the United States to intervene in other countries? Or should we focus on the needs of Americans first? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious what you think. Sure.
In a way, kind of the Spider-Man letters, great power comes with great responsibility.
Sure.
And we feel responsible for frontline, even if they're from the other side of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But we're sending our own soldiers to battle. Yes, we're helping them out, but in the process, we're killing our own people.
Sure. Sure.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. And it didn't help that less than a year earlier we had intervened in Somalia, and then one of our helicopters was shot down, and then they dragged the bodies of the soldiers through the streets of Mogadishu for everyone to see, right? That kind of made us reluctant to intervene in another crisis. Sure. There was a UN peacekeeping force on the ground in Rwanda, but there were only about 300 soldiers, and they weren't allowed to fire their weapons unless fired upon. So they could literally come across someone being murdered in the streets and they could do nothing about it, which is a failure on the UN not to be like, shoot the damn people, right? Like, shoot the people who are killing people. And part of the reason we chose not to intervene was President Clinton was under the mistaken impression that if we called it genocide, we would have to intervene. What the 1948 UN Genocide Convention essentially says is, here's what genocide is defined as. Here's what constitutes acts of genocide. Anyone who is a signatory to the convention, if they believe genocide is going on, has to refer the matter to the UN Security Council. After that, it's up to the UN to decide. Clinton thought if we called it genocide, we would have to intervene militarily. He didn't actually understand that to fulfill our obligation, all we had to do was go to the Security Council and say, look, genocide is happening on the ground in Rwanda, let's do something about it. And we would have fulfilled our obligation. We could have chosen to provide weapons to the people on the ground in Rwanda rather than personnel. So Clinton ended up going to Rwanda 4 years later, got out of the plane in Kigali, spent 4 hours in the airport saying sorry about this, and left again. But he later said it was one of the biggest regrets of his presidency that we didn't actually intervene in Rwanda. The Bush administration got it right. In 2005, with the genocide in Darfur, we referred the matter to the Security Council and gave aid to the UN and African Union mission on the ground. So if Clinton had actually understood what the Genocide Convention said, he might have chosen to call it genocide. The other problem that happened in 1994 was one of the rotating members on the Security Council was the government of Rwanda. So you had the government committing genocide saying, nothing's going on here, we're not doing anything wrong. So obviously not an ideal situation, right? You don't want a country committing genocide sitting on the Security Council going, no, nothing's going on in our country. So it's kind of a perfect storm that happened in Rwanda. And yeah, it didn't help that Americans were looking at this and going, I don't think we really want to get involved in this mess. So yeah, it is difficult, right? The decisions we make have consequences. We chose not to intervene. This happened. If we'd chosen to intervene, maybe something else would have happened. So it is difficult. There's no clear-cut, easy solution for foreign policy, for knowing when to step in and when not to. Yeah. Which makes foreign policy tricky. It's one of the hardest areas of policy to really understand. There's no clear-cut answer. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no perfect way to know what the outcome is going to be. So it's very complicated. And it's complicated for people to understand. So it's one of those areas of policy where unless you really understand what's going on, you're not going to really know how to respond. You're not really going to know what's going on. So yeah, it's tricky. It's a very tricky area for the government to try and deal with. So if you want to learn more about Rwanda, Ghost of Rwanda is one of the best documentaries. There's also a couple of films, Hotel Rwanda, I don't know if any of you have seen it, that's one movie. I prefer the movie Beyond the Gates. It's more realistic about what happened in Rwanda. So if you want to watch a movie that's a bit more realistic, Beyond the Gates is a little bit better. It's more graphic, unfortunately, than Hotel Rwanda, but it is a little bit more realistic. There's also a really good book, and the title is very long. The title is We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families. Yeah, it's a hell of a title, right? It's the first book written after the genocide by a journalist named Philip Gorovich, who spent 4 years in Rwanda kind of understanding what happened during the genocide. So that's honestly, I think, one of the best books to read because it's not an academic book, but it's a pretty good read if you're interested in learning more about what happened. Okay, any other thoughts, comments? No? Okay. So your final exam is due next Thursday. Since you guys are in the Thursday cohort, you have until next Thursday. Same exact format as the midterm. 4 short essay questions, page to a page and a half per question, double spaced, open book, open note, etc., etc. Are there any questions on the final? Okay, so it's due in Blackboard. You'll have 2 attempts to upload the exam. It will go through Safe Assign just to double check and make sure you guys didn't like try to buy an exam and turn it in. Not that you guys would do that, but just in case. So you'll have 2 attempts to turn in the exam. If you get done with it early, of course, you can just go ahead and upload it. But you have until next Thursday at 11:59 p.m. to submit the final. So we will meet here next Thursday. I'll show you a short documentary, and then we'll be done with class. So those of you online, you do not have to be online next Thursday for class, because I will not be recording next Thursday's class. And if you can't make it next Thursday, that's fine. I know you have other finals, other projects, so if you can't make it, it's not a problem. Okay? If you have any questions over the weekend, you can email me or call or text me. Otherwise, enjoy